When I was reporting from Africa, I learned that hunger is a political problem as much as a meteorological one. As a foreign correspondent for the Associated Press, I covered at least a half dozen food crises, and almost every time an editor asked me, "Are you getting enough to eat?" I said, "Of course I am." At the Hotel de Grand Lac in Zaire, they served caviar while Rwandan refugees were starving just a mile away. After visiting starving nomads in the south of Kenya, I could buy a pizza for $4 in Nairobi, a mere 30 minutes away. Rich countries frequently suffer droughts, just like any other part of the world, but the impact here is economic. It doesn't result in famine. Disturbingly, the number of people suffering from hunger has been on the rise over the last 3 years. As Kate pointed out, 88% of countries face a serious burden of either 2 or 3 forms of malnutrition. And malnutrition can be micronutrients like vitamin A and iron, or it could be obesity, where someone's eating way too much carbohydrates and not enough protein. 2 billion people suffer from that type of malnutrition. Where there is a food crisis, there is always a political opportunity, especially for extremists who offer utopian visions to desperate people in return for their fighting-age men. I visited al-Shabaab camps in Somalia, where young men joined the Islamic militia just so they could get 2 meals a day. Food insecurity after decades of civil war in Afghanistan contributed to the rise of the Taliban. And in 2001, I watched Afghan farmers pull up cauliflower and other vegetables so that they could plant opium, taking away a key crop. The rise of al-Qaeda affiliates in the African Sahel is linked to food shortages, and hunger frequently leads to extremism. Tonight we have 2 leaders in U.S. national security with us to discuss the vexing problem of food insecurity, its impact on U.S. national security, and what the U.S. can and cannot do to address these problems. This is a huge topic and we don't have a lot of time, so you'll forgive me if I don't ask any questions that are off topic. And we'd like to start with some opening remarks, first from Congressman McCaul.
No, thanks, Chris, and thanks to the LBJ School for this invitation. It's always an honor to be here, and also to be in the presence of a hero of mine, Admiral McRaven, who I consider to be a friend as well. And we thank you for what you've done for the nation. Sure. Everybody knows what you did. I think to Chris's point, poverty breeds conflict, and conflict breeds poverty. It's a vicious circle. And when I get my threat briefings in the Capitol in a classified sense, we go around the world as chairman of Homeland Security. Where are the hot spots out there? And it's a lot of the countries you mentioned. It's Yemen, also it's Somalia with al-Shabaab popping up. It's Nigeria with Boko Haram. It's frankly Syria, Northern Africa, and the whole Sahel region in Africa, I believe, is vulnerable to extremism because of the impoverished conditions. And to your point, I think it is getting worse. I can read the numbers off, but in some of these countries, almost half the population, and in some 2/3 of the population, are in what's called food insecurity. And that breeds political insecurity, and it breeds terrorism and extremism. So I think these issues really work hand in glove. And I think policymakers and certainly the military, State Department need to be aware of this and work as one government and with the USAID and the NGOs to tackle this worldwide epidemic that we're seeing right now. And it's also in our hemisphere in Venezuela right now. We got a huge refugee crisis taking place. They said the average Venezuelan lost 22 pounds last year because of the food conditions. So I look forward to this very interesting conversation and of course, being here with the Admiral. Thank you.
Admiral McRaven.
Well, thanks, Chris, and let me also thank Congressman McCaul for your service, sir. It's been great working with you when I was in uniform, and I've enjoyed our friendship since my time here at UT. You know, there was a great book by Bob Kaplan, Robert Kaplan, back in 2012 called "The Revenge of Geography," and it kind of starts off with the premise that everybody thinks we're kind of coming into this virtual world where you have online shopping, and when your social networks are built around social media, and your IP address is critically important. But of course, what Kaplan points out is it's all about terrain. And since the history of mankind, it has always been about terrain and the environment that surrounds the populations. And I'll tell you, that was really brought home to me when I was in Afghanistan, even more so than Iraq. A place called the Korengal Valley up in the Konar province. And as you go into this kind of long stretch of valley in the Hindu Kush, you know, the first thing you ask yourself is, why in the world would people live here when there are better places to live? But the Afghans have been living in the Korengal Valley for thousands of years, since Alexander came into Afghanistan. And you find that there are four things that drive why people live there. First, it is the security. It is a defendable valley from the standpoint of the people that are there. Second, it has an access point. It has a road. It is also a place where they can have a certain amount of sustainable food, and of course there is water. And so as you begin to look at the things that drive populations, water and food security are the two primary things. And it is interesting, as we try to look towards the future, we sometimes dismiss the importance of these things. But when you think about water, and you think about, 97% of the Earth's water is salty. 3% of it, so you got about 2% that is either in the polar ice caps, or it's in dams, or it's in aquifers. So about 1% of the world's water is really drinkable. And it is also 1% of the world's water that people fight over. So that water, of course, is also part of what sustains the food security. So I will tell you, from the standpoint of a military man and somebody that understands national security, it is all connected. The terrain is connected, the water is connected, the food security is connected. And I think as we begin to look at the future of how we deal with food security, we need to understand these impacts. I guess I'll leave you with one final thing. When I think about global food security, you think again about terrain, you think about politics that Chris talked about, you think about culture and environment. So when I think about terrain, if you take a look at Yemen, for example, in Yemen, they have a water shortage that is probably unparalleled in the world. Part of that is because they plant khat, and khat is a narcotic that the Yemenis chew on. But the problem with khat is it is a plant that absorbs a lot of water. So a little bit like the economics and the incentives of the poppies in Afghanistan, the reason the Afghans grew poppies is because they couldn't make any money off the cauliflower. The reason people grow khat, even though it takes up all the water, is because, of course, it is incentivized through the cost of the khat. The politics, there are some places around the world where, as much as USAID, Americans in the international community want to help, people don't want our help, because the politics is such that they're not happy to have boxes of USAID stamped with the stars and bars on it. There is the issue of culture. We talk about this dilemma of certain populations where they're both malnourished and obese. And frankly, here in Texas, we have some of those problems, where the nature of the culture is that they are high salt, high fat, high sugar content that make the young men and women obese and yet are not good for nutrition. And then, of course, there is the whole problem of climate change and the environment. So I think as we look at the future, we really do have to think about global food security. We have to think about water security. And I think you do this by recognizing that it is a problem that the nation states have got to deal with, the international community has to deal with. It is about education. It is about infrastructure. And I think it is about incentivizing good behavior. And that is a challenge, particularly when your life is about making $1 off a poppy crop or a potato or cauliflower crop. It's hard to incentivize good behavior, but it's something we need to accept that challenge and move forward with it. So thanks, Chris.
Thank you. Congressman, as the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, and a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Are your fellow members of Congress talking enough about these issues? How do they come up? Is it, my profession will never bring this up in this current political environment. I'm hoping that smarter people behind closed doors are having these conversations. What can you tell us about Washington?
I think they are, particularly on the Foreign Affairs Committee. I think there's a tendency running for office to say foreign aid is a waste of money and let's cut it. And that's an easy political slogan. I think it could be reformed, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But I think when the administration proposed a 20% cut to foreign aid, that was met with resistance by the Congress, if that makes you feel any better. Because I think, as General Mattis said, and he gave us a little bit of cover, he said, if you do that, we're just got to make more bullets. And he's right. I mean, we can reform foreign aid, and I think the Global Fragility Act that I introduced will take on the way state, DOD, and USAID work together as a unity of government, because right now they're at all different purposes, cross purposes, and have them work together. So we can reform the way we do this. But I think an absolute 20% cut across the board would be dangerous because these nations would get worse, not better, and then the threat of terrorism and extremism will get great and not better. And so I think those conversations, we've had, I enjoy it actually on my committee, great bipartisanship. Almost, I'd say 99% of my bills have passed unanimously. And the Foreign Affairs Committee, I think, enjoys the same sort of bipartisanship because we see national security as not a Republican Democrat issue, but an American issue. And they don't check our party affiliation when we go overseas. And we go overseas quite a bit to see these countries, to see what needs to be addressed. And I don't know where ISIS is now at the fall of the caliphate. I've seen the rise and fall of it. We're not quite sure where they're going. We think Euphrates. We think they may be headed back to northern Africa and the Sahel region, which is not good for Africa. And the more impoverished and lack of governance that you have, which is what we had in Afghanistan. We had a complete breakdown and lack of governance, as you saw when you're embedded over there. And it's those safe havens, like what we saw in Iraq and Syria after that conflict. When you have a vacuum and lack of governance, it's going to be filled by countries like Iran or radical extremist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So I think this is a whole government approach we need to be taking a look at. We did pass the Global Food Security Act, which provides, it was bipartisan, provides $1 billion in assistance for food security and also malnutrition, which kind of reminds me of when we passed PEPFAR, a decade ago that dealt with the AIDS epidemic. I think there's an apparatus in place with, say, PEPFAR that we can do other things with.
Well, let me ask you about a piece of legislation you have pending, the Global Fragility and Violence Reduction Act. It's been endorsed by 39 aid agencies. And if you could explain more about what you're asking for, because it seems like you're asking USAID, DOD, the State Department to kind of rethink their whole approach. Is that right? And
this would be the reforming of foreign aid. Not saying a 20% blanket cut, but how can we perform better with the money that the Congress appropriates? And I think, it's just like before 9/11. If the FBI is not working with the CIA or the DOD, get a breakdown in communication. Same thing with foreign aid. I mean, why isn't the DOD and the State Department and USAID working more in concert together rather than what could be at cross purposes? That could provide a more effective and efficient use of our tax dollars and a way to reform it rather than slash it.
Admiral, in Djibouti, we have the Combined Joint Task Force Horn of Africa. I spent a lot of time with them over the years with 3 different commanders. And I noticed that there was this constant dynamic where every ambassador in the region was expecting the Joint Task Force to take care of everything. Right. You had the money, you had the DOD had the money, DOD had the troops. I watched soldiers inoculate cattle, drill water wells. I talk about oil in my regular job, so There are other kinds of wells. Is that, is that too much pressure on the Pentagon to have to be not only the war-fighting arm, but also the humanitarian arm of the government? Do we need to rethink that?
Well, the military has done humanitarian aid since there was a military. I mean, you think about the Berlin airlift when you go back even the last century. But the fact of the matter is, in Africa, we have a very concerted effort with the State Department in how we distribute humanitarian aid. And the reason the military does it, of course, is because we have the resources, because we have the lift capability with the helicopters. We've got the ships bring it in, they bring it into a port. We've got the lift with the helicopters or small airplanes to get it to a remote location where it needs to, or we go by convoy. So the State Department doesn't have those kind of resources. But I can tell you, in every single country in Africa or anywhere we do this, the first stop a military commander makes is to the ambassador's office, to sit down with the ambassador, to sit down with the ambassador's team and say, where do you need this humanitarian assistance delivered? Now, obviously, if it's a crisis, if it's a tsunami in Indonesia, if it's a typhoon in the Philippines or an earthquake in Pakistan, the military comes in pretty quickly. But if it is a deliberate, long-term process, then it is a thoughtful plan where the host country, really in concert with the ambassador, decides where that aid's going to go. And then we in the military provide that aid and provide those resources to get them out to the hinterlands. The reason that's important is it gets back to stability. You don't want a fragile, unstable country. That's not good for anybody. So finding out where those hotspots are, and USAID has a fragility index. So they can tell you every country in the world and why it's fragile, where it is most fragile, and how to address that fragility. And so, again, working with the State Department, that's what the military does. It's been a very successful partnership. It is not without its controversy. It is not without its friction, because the military sometimes sees the opportunity also, frankly, to get out in places where the bad guys are. So there is a dynamic between the military commander and the ambassador. The ambassador says, look, I want to bore or dig boreholes here in Niger. And we say, great, we're happy to do that, but we'd like to also get up where the Tuaregs are so we can kind of see what's happening up there. And again, it's a great discussion, deliberation, but at the end of the day, the State Department makes the decision on where we exercise that humanitarian assistance.
So you're comfortable with the balance because AID used to contract with NGOs and other aid agencies to do a lot of this work. Some military commanders are concerned that, making that shift from a humanitarian operation into warfighting and then back again to a peacekeeping operation is difficult. And frankly, a lot of the Africans I spoke to were a little offended by the force protection, right. The guards that would go out to protect the veterinarians and the engineers who were providing the aid.
Yeah, again, it's a difficult balance at times. So again, let's take Niger or Chad or Nigeria. A lot of times the U.S. military does in fact contract with locals because, to your point, we understand the dynamics on the ground. And the last thing you want to do is have a soldier in battle dress uniform showing up at a far-end location. That doesn't serve anybody well. So you take U.S. government money, you contract with the locals in support of the State Department to get the humanitarian aid there. Now, frankly, sometimes, as I said, when the devastating earthquake hit Pakistan back in 2010 or thereabouts, there was concern from the Pakistani government. They didn't want American military in uniform delivering aid. But at the end of the day, they had to save these folks up near the Kashmir area, and the only way to get aid there was through MH-47 helicopters with folks in uniform. And the Pakistanis did the right thing and allowed us to come in. But it is always a challenge, and it is always a difficult balance. And then again, at the end of the day, we'll defer to what the State Department and the host nation think is the appropriate way to tackle the problem.
Chairman, you passed the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Act. Mm-hmm. And that kind of addresses this interaction between, when to use aid workers and T-shirts, when to use troops, and the overlap between counterterrorism and food security, right?
Yeah, and it's primarily directed at the Sahel. Again, that's where big counterterrorism effort is playing out. And I think to the Admiral's point, state and military sort of play hand in glove. I was in Afghanistan when they had our military as basically humanitarian assistance providers. I think to some extent I agree with you. The population views that as this guy in a uniform with sort of intimidating looking presence. So it's a delicate balance. How you do this, but I think again, Matt has said something to the effect of the military's job is to apply maximum pressure so the diplomats can do their job, and I think that if you're trying to define the rules, that's really. But you go back to the Marshall Plan, my dad's war, World War II. One of the best things we did was provide that airlift assistance that didn't recreate the conditions after World War I, and I think that's where a lot of this stems. Would the average soldier rather be fighting terrorists, or would he rather be a humanitarian worker? I think he'd probably be rather fighting terrorists, but it's a delicate balance.
Well, again, I think you're right, sir. When you look back about the Berlin airlift and the rebuilding of Europe after World War II, and frankly, the rebuilding of Japan after World War II, what we found out, of course, is both the Europeans and the Japanese became our closest allies because of the way we handled that reconstruction. So the military, to your point, we know how to do reconstruction. It is the same Corps of Engineers that build the dams and the levees can help with the reconstruction. The same kids that do the fighting can help in the small villages in Afghanistan and Iraq build schools and do other things like that. So the skill set, interestingly enough, is not that different. In the Philippines several years ago, typhoon comes through and really has a devastating effect on the Philippines. The first people in were the Special Operations Forces. The reason they were the first people in is because we had MC-130 airplanes that could get into remote fields in order to bring in the Air Force combat controllers that could set up a tower so that we could bring in other airlift in order to provide the Filipino population food and water. Well, that couldn't be done except with a Special Operations Force that, if called upon, within a moment's notice could turn into a fighting force. But the skills that allow us to be superb soldiers are similar skills that allow us to be superb humanitarians.
I think where it plays best is in these hot spots where you want the humanitarian assistance, you want to provide stability, but it's so dangerous that you need the security forces there to protect State Department and the NGOs.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's been a lot of talk about cutting foreign aid. The State Department's never been smaller than it is today, or at least not in recent history. China is beginning to fill a void that we once filled. They're the ones that are building roads now. They're the ones that are building ports. They're really competing with us for influence. Are you concerned about that?
Very concerned, and whether it's foreign counterintelligence briefings or State Department, China, with their one belt, one road policy, it's 2025 vision to dominate the world both militarily and economically. And in the cyberspace, as the Admiral knows, they're stealing billions of dollars, if not trillions, in intellectual property, military technology transfers. This is pretty serious stuff. And the espionage, 20 million security clearances stolen, including ours, sitting here from China. But they are influencing the region now, and they're winning. They will go into these African nations and exploit them with high leverage loans. They first bribe them with a suitcase of cash, and we'll build a soccer stadium for you if you'll let us come in. And then they over leverage them. They bring their own workers in from China, not the host nation in Africa. They extract their natural resources, and then they essentially default on the loan, and China's there to take it over like they did in Sri Lanka and Djibouti. They have a base now in Djibouti where we have one. So this is getting, to me, and they do it, sort of in a deceptive way when they move in, and that's the competition, I think, for the African continent. I had dinner with 8 ambassadors last month, and I said, well, why do you do business with the Chinese? You know they're just exploiting you. And their answer was very simply, because you're not there. American interests are not there. I'm working on a bill with the Undersecretary of Economics to get our ambassadors, not just from a diplomacy role, but rather advancing our economic interests in the region. This is where I think OPIC has a role to play. And I know the guy that's the president now, he's taking over our Overseas Private Investment Corporation, can supplant our foreign aid by investing overseas in projects that can bring a real return on our investment, while at the same time our influence abroad and helping stabilize these countries, particularly the ones in the African continent.
Admiral, famously we had the Battle of Mogadishu that really kind of forced the Clinton administration to rethink its humanitarian intervention. You know, I was based in Rwanda right after the genocide, and you know, people there talk about, you know, the lack of U.S. intervention in that crisis, and the President Clinton later apologized for that. Can you speak a little bit to what the military has learned over the years about these operations? Lessons learned, best practices, what they can do going forward?
Yeah, so Chris, as you know, we referred to it as Operation Restore Hope, which was our kind of humanitarian assistance into Somalia. The problem was there was a group of bad guys that were kind of stealing the food, that were using food as a weapon. And so the infamous kind of Black Hawk Down incident in Mogadishu in October caused us to kind of rethink whether or not we were, in fact, or should get involved in humanitarian assistance. But as I've said before, I think we have to be careful about that narrative. Unfortunately, again, the Clinton administration took away from that, that because of the risk, that's where we lost 18 servicemen in the Black Hawk Down incident. The administration took away from that we have to be very, very careful as we get involved in humanitarian aid around the world, or in helping civil conflicts, genocides, as it is in Rwanda. I would almost kind of separate those two issues. So we had a special operation that went horribly wrong, although incredibly heroic on the part of the soldiers as they fought to get their comrades back. Unfortunately, again, we lost a lot of Americans that day. That doesn't mean that the idea of providing humanitarian assistance to the Somalis was wrong. You look at a number of operations we've had over the years, Provide Comfort up in northern Iraq, that fundamentally changed, in a good way, the thinking about the United States of America, and provided support to hundreds of thousands of folks. But unfortunately, when you have an incident that is as dramatic and as difficult as it was for Black Hawk Down, it does skew how the public thinks about it. I'll get back to something Congressman McCaul said, because I think it is important. I'm a big believer in the State Department. If it were up to me, I would grow the State Department to probably 5 times the size it is now. The fact of the matter is, you want great diplomats in places where they can make a difference before you have to send the military in, before we have a civil war, before you have famine that occurs. And what a lot of people don't understand, I think, about the nature of the State Department is, it's not just these ambassadors, some of which are political appointees, and it's the first time they've ever stepped into an embassy. It is the rank and file and the career foreign service folks that really make the wheels of progress turn in these countries in which they're in. And they are so well steeped in the culture, in the history, in understanding the problems. So back to my initial comments about how does the military do humanitarian assistance. The reason the first place we go is to the country team is because the men and women who serve on the country team of an ambassador know this country backwards and forwards. They know where the landmines are, both figuratively and literally. And they can help navigate us, being the green suitors, around the difficulties that we might encounter in a country, and make some positive changes. So I think as we look towards the future, again, let's beef up our diplomatic services. You're always going to have the military. I mean, the military has the resources. That's not going to change. We're always going to do humanitarian assistance because we're good at it. But we need to be very thoughtful about it and not, again, to the reform issue of it. Is there some areas where we can reform foreign aid? Absolutely. But I would much rather give foreign aid than have to go fight someplace. And I've had to do that before, so I'm okay with more foreign aid and more diplomacy.
And the first we lead delegations overseas, and it's great because we have no party label. We're Americans representing the United States, and our first stop is always it's called the in-country team briefing with the ambassador and his team. And he has a team from the chief of station, which is the CIA, to almost every branch of service. And so you get this great sort of briefing before you meet the world leaders about what's going on in that country, what's going on with the governance, what are the hotspot issues, and it's a great education. And I think every major military conflict, though, has started because of a major breakdown in foreign policy, to the Admiral's point. If we don't get the foreign policy right, and you can argue about Vietnam and we can argue about Iraq, but if you don't get it right and you send the military in, you can really screw things up. I think that is you got to get the foreign policy right in the first place. And I think I was in Pakistan meeting with Pakistani businessmen and Indian businessmen. Well, Pakistan and India hate each other, but they were sitting at the table together, and the embassy put it together to really demonstrate that, economic interests can overcome some of these beliefs and belief systems. And I think at the end of the day, it's not going to be the military occupying countries, but rather our economic influence and interests and values that will, at the end of the day, I think, prevail and win.
Well, my takeaway from living in Africa was that it was the business people who build countries more than anything else. If you have I would rate a country on its stability based on whether or not a high school kid wanted to be a politician or a businessman. And if all the entrepreneurial spirit was going to be focused on politics, I knew this was an unstable country. Which is to say,
it doesn't bode very well for the two of us.
It should have been in business. I don't know.
Well, I mean,
where did military rank in that?
It's very hard to get into an African army. It's a popular job, but the point is that a lot of this has to be fixed from within. It's not something that the United States can do. I'd like to hear from both of you about what are the limits of U.S. foreign policy and security policy. When do we, where do we risk pushing too far into what's none of our business, and where do we risk pulling back too much?
If I can tell you, and I don't know the Admiral's view on this, I think when we're viewed as an occupier, just like Alexander the Great, when we went into Vietnam and were viewed as an occupier after the French had been there and the Chinese, it's very, very difficult to win that kind of conflict when we're viewed as an occupier in any of these countries. I mean, so I think the great mistake with Iraq, though, was once we did get in there, we didn't have a residual force, and then we left a total vacuum that Al-Qaeda in Iraq then morphed into ISIS and basically filled the vacuum and then had a governance state of the caliphate. Once we get in, we better be damn sure we're gonna win it, and then not stay to occupy. We can have residual forces like we do all over the world to help provide stability, but I think when we start getting into the occupying business, we don't do so well.
I couldn't agree more. Let me give you a little micro example of, I think, kind of the macro problem. And you'll appreciate this, Chris. When we were in Afghanistan, one of our special forces team went into one of the small villages, and we realized that the closest drinking water was almost an hour walk away from the village. So, being good Americans, we thought, well, hey, we're gonna show them how good we are, and maybe we can build some some friendships and win the hearts and minds. So we brought in some engineers so that we could pipe the water from the well that was an hour walk away into the local village. And I remember the SF guys, the Special Forces guys, talking to me about the fact that the village elders weren't initially very keen on us doing this. And we didn't quite understand why, but we were Americans, we understood they needed fresh water, the kids needed fresh water. So we built the pipeline from the well to the, right outside the village. Well, what we found was the reason they didn't want us to build it is because the women in the village would walk for an hour to that well. And that was an hour that they were together in a social setting. They loved to go to the well. They would get to the well. They would socialize at the well. This was an important part of the culture of that village, and we had just destroyed it inadvertently. It took us a long time before we figured that out, and finally somehow the pipes broke, and we never went in and fixed it. But back to your point about the limits of U.S. involvement. I mean, I think this again on the micro, the macro is the same thing. So as we look at how do we get involved in a country, back to my point about the State Department and the people that have lived there and understand the dynamics. You really do have to sit down and understand the culture, the importance of the terrain, the security issues. Of course, in a place like Afghanistan or anywhere else where it is a tribal culture, you can't cross tribal lines. So if you don't understand where those tribal boundaries are, and you think by building a school in one location is going to serve that region, only to find out that you have now disenfranchised the other location. So this is about really understanding the culture in a way that again, most military people can't. So I think as long as you rely on the people, again, the host nation, first and foremost, the State Department people that are there and make that part of their livelihood, the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations that do this for a living, they're the ones that I think have to shape the plan. Is there a limit to what Americans can do? Absolutely there is. And to the Congressman's point, the last thing you want to do is put boots on the ground to solve a problem in a way that could have been solved locally.
So I'm going to move to the submitted questions. The global, so this one is for Admiral McRaven. I think there's a follow-up for you, Chairman. The Global Food Security Act was passed in 2016 and requires the executive branch to develop a strategy to promote global food security, nutrition, and growth. The Global Food Security Strategy, published in September 2016, did not outline any responsibilities for the Defense Department. In your opinion, should the DoD have explicit responsibilities to support this strategy? If so, what should they be? And if not, what role should DoD hold?
Well, it's a complex problem and maybe a complex answer, but I do not think the DoD should be explicitly laid out in that particular act, because at the end of the day, the Department of Defense is there to do just that. It is about the American military. It is about providing hard power and soft power where it is appropriate to do so. And I'm afraid if we start down that slope, that slippery slope of being, apportioned out and having specific details in a lot of these different acts, then before long, the resources of the military no longer go to their primary focus. Having said that, the Department of Defense absolutely understands we have a humanitarian assistance role. When you take a look at the amphibious force, for example, when we think about the great amphib ships and the Marines that are on them, what a lot of people don't realize is most of those amphibious ships also carry foodstuffs for humanitarian assistance. And so when something goes through the Pacific, immediately the amphibious Navy marshals resources and sends big amphibious ships with helicopters, with V-22 tilt-rotor aircraft, with Marines that deliver humanitarian assistance. That is not by chance. That is rehearsed. That is trained for. I mean, these are the sort of things the military does. So humanitarian assistance is absolutely a mission set within the military. It's just not the primary mission set, because as I said before, we know that the skill sets of flying helicopters, setting up landing fields, delivering food aid, these are skill sets that are part and parcel to being a soldier. So to the person who asked the question, I would say, I think it's appropriate that we are not specifically called out in that particular act. But having said that, we clearly have a role, and we understand what that role is.
Yeah, I think
Chairman, I was going to say, Chairman McCaul, you actually helped get that act passed. So what did Admiral McRaven answer the question properly?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm never going to disagree with the Admiral. That wouldn't put me in a good spot. He has a lot of friends that know how to shoot really well. But having said, I think...
And deliver humanitarian assistance.
But
I got to say, when those...
Well, too. And so and I know many of them, they provide a great service to the nation as well. This, I think the State Department, and it was authorized Foreign Affairs Committee for the State Department. They take the lead. They write the strategy. But I think it does need to be done in coordination with the DOD, and I think that's what the Admiral is referring to. Not that the DOD writes this policy. I think it's truly a State Department lead function, but it should be done in consultation and coordination with the Department of Defense, which is sort of what my Global Fragility Act calls for, is when we look at foreign aid, not just state, it has to be USAID, state, and DOD coordinating together, as well as these NGOs that I think provide so much charitable relief. We got to be careful, like if you look at Central America, where we got a real mess going on with Venezuela and then Central America, and you got a mass exodus problem. And when you put foreign aid down there, you want to make sure it's going to the right leaders and not going into a corrupt government and then going down a cesspool. And that's always a tricky thing. And you probably saw this in Afghanistan, when you're throwing all this money into a country, and you have to make sure that there's some stability in governance and it's going to the right places to be most effective, and not just down a rat hole.
And Chairman, the next question is actually a natural follow-up. The Global Food Strategy emphasizes a whole-of-government approach through interagency coordination. In line with this emphasis on collaboration, what role can the private and nonprofit sectors play in advancing global food security, and how can Congress support those efforts?
Yeah, and I think it's a unity of government effort, but it has to be done, again, with the private sector, both the charitable arm of the private sector and also the investment side of the private sector. I think through overseas investment, again, with OPIC, we can do a lot of good in these countries and benefit everybody. I think the best thing we can do is lift their economies through our investment. And then, again, you take care of the poverty issue. You take care of the governance problem and the chaos and the extremism. So I think they all have to be, it's always the adage, the left hand doesn't know what the right's doing in the federal government, and it's very true. And we throw all this money, but they're not working together as a team when it should be a team effort approach. And I think that's the goal behind my bill, is looking at fragile nations. How can we work as a team to stabilize them so we don't have to deal with these problems down the road in a military fashion?
Thank you. Admiral McRaven, looking at the situation evolving in Venezuela right now, how do you see acute food insecurity contributing to the ongoing conflict, and is something that we need to address as part of our conflict resolution efforts? How do concerns about food insecurity affect the development of a U.S. military strategic response in such a complex situation? Well,
I think Venezuela, it kind of personifies a lot of the problems that we have when you're dealing with a country that is in chaos, and how does the military view it? So, again, Venezuela aside, I don't want to get too specific on a specific country, but as a normal matter of routine, again, we're going to look at humanitarian assistance as a way of positive leverage, if you will, in a host nation. So if we know if there is conflict in a particular country, again, working with the State Department, working with all the various intel agencies, to the Congressman's point, just to give you a sense of how we do this operationally. So video teleconferences are a big deal in the military. So let's say country X is having a problem. The first thing that's going to happen is the combatant commander, whether it is appropriate or not, the military generally takes the lead. So the combatant commander, a 4-star Army, Navy, Air Force, or Marine general officer, We'll host a video teleconference, and it will include the ambassador and their country team. It will include Maine State. It will generally include somebody in the White House. It will include people within the executive branch, within the intelligence community, so we understand what the situation is on the ground. It'll include the FBI, so we understand what the law enforcement issues are. It will include USAID. So we all get on in a virtual room, and we talk through the problems. That's in a crisis situation. I think to the Congressman's point, what we don't do well is long-term in terms of how are we going to apply our humanitarian aid in a whole-of-government constructive fashion where we have a long-term plan. We do it well on a case-by-case basis in a crisis. I don't think anybody does it better. Where I don't think we do it well is because most of these appointees, I mean, they're there for a couple of years and they're gone. Somebody's in there for a couple of years. So you can't build a long-term plan that everybody agrees on for the next 10 years. That's where I think we fall down. Operationally, we do it well. So a country like Venezuela or any other country in crisis, we could handle that pretty well. Long-term, over 10 years, how do we invest in Africa? How do we invest in South America? How do we invest in the Middle East? That we don't do so well.
Well, I mean, Congressman, if I can ask you to follow up on that, on the Admiral's remarks, that does seem to be a chronic problem in U.S. foreign assistance. You have a lot of politicians, not you, but others, who might see things on a shorter term cycle. They want to see results quicker. The administration changes at a fairly accelerated rate. I know our Pan-Colombia plan to help them has had great results, yeah. But that took 3 administrations to agree to stick to it. And problems, frankly, in Africa are generational. If you've got kids that have been sitting in a refugee camp for 27 years, it may take another 27 years to solve that problem. Can you talk a little bit about how to address that?
No, I think it has to be a long-term strategy that we're willing to implement. I mean, the military is great at executing, but a long-term strategy that we're going to stick by. And that's the problem with foreign policy; can change every 4 years depending on who's in the White House. But I think like you mentioned, Plan Colombia was one of the most successful operations, taking a failed state and turning into one of the best governance countries in Latin America. Venezuela is a little different. We needed a long-term strategy for that. Central America, we have a Central American security initiative, but we have to stick by those plans. Otherwise, we're going to have more problems down the road. And I think that long-term, look at China. They have a long-term plan. They don't change every 4 years. That one belt, one road, it's happening. And it's 2025. And President Xi is not going to be in there, we know, for his lifetime. And his foreign policy is not going to change. I'm not advocating we change the Constitution in 4-year presidential terms, but I do think it's important that leaders in the Congress who are there longer than 4 years, a 4-year administration, keep this in mind, that we need to have that long-term vision, because otherwise we'll fail.
Well, I spent 20 years with the Associated Press, and one of the things that I learned was that 90% of peace agreements fail within 5 years. That's how unstable they are, and that's usually because of a lack of commitment that donors make. And it's not just the U.S., it's global. It's a global problem that everyone's excited about getting the agreement signed, and they're excited about the first 18 months of implementing the agreement, but they tend to fall apart. And I mean, obviously we're seeing that in South Sudan right now as part of a problem.
Chris, can I add on to the
Sure.
discussion on Plan Colombia, because I think this is an important example of how things are done well. Now, again, we put billions, with a B, billions of dollars into Colombia, but where we had, what was different with Colombia is the Colombian government showed progress on their own. So we had, to your point, over 3 administrations. But the reason we were able to continue it across the administrations was because the Colombians are the ones that went after the FARC. The Colombians are the ones that tried to clean up their own program. Under President Uribe, I mean, he made some incredibly difficult decisions that I'm not sure a lot of other foreign leaders would have made that got them on the path to success. So if you can show success, then I think the U.S. administrations will continue. The problem is, much like the peace agreements, we put millions of dollars into a plan. The next thing you know, there's a new prime minister, a new president, a new approach in that particular country, and whatever we invested in no longer shows any progress, and we're left kind of holding the bag. Plan Colombia, again, you have to give a whole lot of credit to the Colombians for the success there.
Well, and I think that's also what Congress looks for, right? They want to see that the countries where this money is going, it's producing results, and there's a commitment on the other side.
Going back to what Admiral talked about, Uribe, I mean, I'll never forget when Bush struck this agreement with them, and Congress was going to slap it down. And that's precisely what we shouldn't be. I mean, we need that long-term stability commitment to Colombia. And at the end of the day, the agreement went forward, and to the Admiral's point, I mean, Colombia is providing the buffer now between the FARC, a terrorist organization, and the chaos in Colombia. I can't underestimate or understate to you how bad it is in Venezuela right now. It rivals Syria in terms of refugees. Their economy is tanking, and we need to take a look at our own backyard sometimes as well, because I think what's happening in Colombia, it could be a complete disaster.
Well, and
did I say Colombia? I meant Venezuela.
Yeah, you meant Venezuela. But there are other countries in Central America, and we're receiving migrants from those countries as well. So,
and Colombia is taking in a lot of those refugees.
But I will go back also to the issue of politics that I mentioned in my opening remarks. Some of those Latin American countries don't want our help. It is just their pride is too great to be able to accept help from the United States. And unfortunately, they do so, I think, to their detriment.
Chairman, the next question is for you. How do you see global food insecurity as linked to conflict and violent extremism? How might investment in global health and development help mitigate the risks of extremism?
Well, I mean, so, health, nutrition, stability, poverty, all plays into what conditions do the terrorists, what is ideal for them to operate out of? And so we've seen it time after time. It's Afghanistan, what happened. We saw, in Iraq, we're seeing this happen in Africa. Particularly, I worry about what's happening in Africa. Libya is a failed state. I was in Tunisia, actually with then Mike Pompeo, Congressman, and we were in Egypt with the Sinai Peninsula where Camp North is, and the ISIS guys were up there, to Tunisia, which is having a lot of problems as well, to Libya, which is such a failed state that we actually had to have their ambassador in exile. Can you imagine being an ambassador to a country, but you're not in the country? He's an ambassador in exile briefing us on the conditions in Libya between General Haftar on one end and the other general. They can't even get their governance unified. So therefore, what's happening? ISIS is flourishing in Libya, and Tunisians are going into Libya to train. And it bleeds over into the Sahel. And one wonders, as the caliphate has collapsed, what is going to be the next sort of country or lack of country where they will find governance? And then I think the biggest concern from the military standpoint and homeland is when they can govern like ISIS could, then they can conduct external operations into the United States. So when I would meet with the Southcom or CENTCOM, they would always say our biggest concern is what external operations are they capable of delivering into the United States. The good news is the military stopped, as you know, with your special operators, stopped 99% of these special operations or external operations from happening. And that's why you didn't see so many terror attacks in the United States. But we always worry about fragile nations like that implode, because out of that they can rear their ugly head and attack the United States homeland.
As said, some of these are deeply, deeply complicated problems that not one branch or one agency can address from the government, or that maybe we can't address at all. Another similar issue is climate change. Got a question from online. It says, some say that climate change is responsible for the food insecurity issues worldwide, yet many in Congress deny the science of climate change. How do you and fellow members of HVAC, House Foreign Affairs Committee, take climate change into account when deciding the best course of action in the face of global insecurity and related conflicts?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, that's become a really politically charged issue. But I think one thing is clear on the science, and we can debate what's causing this, if it's a natural or if it's man-made or how much man-made's contributing. But I got a briefing from a NASA scientist who is not a policymaker, but a NASA scientist on the issue. And he showed me that if things don't change, that it's going to dry up. A lot of these areas that we're discussing will get dried up so much that it will be impossible to produce agriculture. So what is that going to mean? Now this is going to be like 50 to 100 years, but long term, what does that mean? And then what can policymakers do to prevent that? I have no reason to believe a NASA scientist would have a political agenda, at least. But when I looked at what will happen if we don't do anything, it's going to get very arid in some of these countries, and then maybe you look at desalinization issues and other ways to deal with it. But I think at some point, Congress is going to have to deal with the issue.
Mm-hmm. The Strauss Center did research on the intersection of climate change effects and violent acts or insecurity. Admiral, have you seen any signs of that link changes in the climate to insecurity or to hotspots?
Well, I mean, I'm absolutely a believer in climate change, and there is clearly a man-made component to it. I don't have any doubts about that. I think when you take a look at, though, from an instability standpoint, I mean, climate change, as it is occurring, it's obviously the pace of change is increasing. But over my 37 years in the military, the pace was so slight that when you saw a conflict, you didn't immediately say, this is a result of climate change. What you saw was, again, I go back to Restore Hope in Somalia. I mean, you had famine and you had food shortages, and well, this happens in conflict areas. It happens in South Sudan. It happens now in Syria. It happens. So you don't have to have climate change in order to generate, conflict in areas. Having said that, I know it is something that the U.S. military looks at now when we look at places where conflict can arise. Again, I go back to the water issue. The military has always recognized the value of water. And whether it is the Haditha Dam in Iraq or whether it is certain dams, whether it's the Ethiopian Dam outside Egypt, I mean, we understand that the flow of water and what water can do for a nation can immediately cause a conflict. So I think as we the military, kind of look into the future, those great folks that do that planning are going to look to areas where it is becoming more arid in the Sahel, where the sea is encroaching on Polynesian islands and the impact of the sea in the South China Sea and those sort of things. The military planners absolutely recognize that this is a problem, and I think are preparing to deal with that in the long run. I know are preparing to deal with that in the long run.
Another online question. We haven't talked about the UN's Sustainable Development Goals yet. Goal number 2 is committed to ending hunger. What do you feel are the U.S. obligations to the international community in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and how do we fulfill these responsibilities?
Well, I think I've mentioned several of the bills we passed in recent, last year or two that try to address that. I think the United Nations absolutely has a purpose and a mission in this, and it should be an international driven purpose, not just the United States of America. I think that's what a lot of people are. They want us to carry all the water, no pun intended from the previous remarks, but I think it's important that the UN comes together to provide that sort of assistance and step up to the plate. We traditionally have borne this on our backs because that's who we are as a people, and that's what we're proud of. But I think it's important that the entire United Nations comes together, and things like we did again with PEPFAR and things like that. I think working with the UN, we have our issues with the United Nations from time to time. We got a problem right now with Russia and China and the sanctions and their violations of those sanctions. And, you know, what is the United Nations going to do about that? What's the United Nations going to do about, you know, the fact that some of the major offenders of human rights are on the Human Rights Security Council and are not all that fair to Israel, in my judgment. But with respect to this issue, the UN absolutely has a vital role to play.
And Admiral, I know the U.S. military has started training other militaries to be able to carry out their own humanitarian operations. We've even seen governments offer to help us, like Mexico.
Yeah, so you mentioned what we refer to as the JSET program, the Joint Combined Exercise for Training. This is where one of the things, particularly U.S. Special Operations, but the conventional forces do it as well, is we go into a country and we train the host nation's Special Operations forces so they can deal with their problems so that we don't have to. Yeah. But part and parcel to that, within the U.S. Special Operations, we have what's referred to as the Civil Affairs branch. And the Civil Affairs folks do, again, engineering. They're also the medics and the veterinarians, and they know how to drill wells, and they have kind of public relations people. They are the kind of soft SOFT power that the hard power of the Special Operations brings. So when we go into another country, what we're hoping to do is, one, professionalize their military. So back to the point that, you know, you can't always choose who your allies are when it's important. Sometimes we go into countries where the host nation is not as professional as the U.S. military. They don't have this sense of moral, legal, ethical that we do, and you try to impress upon them why this is important, why civilian rule of the government is important, but also how to do things like civil affairs, how to take care of their own people in times of Ebola crisis, water crisis, food crisis. This is all part and parcel to, again, what we do as a Special Operations Force around the globe, 90 different countries. That always surprises people because, you know, you tend to think of the raids and the hostage rescues, but frankly, the bulk of our time is spent overseas training host nation militaries to be more professional, to serve their civilian leadership better and to serve their population better, and to be able to deal with crisis in their own country.
Well, and I have to say, you know, the U.S. forces training foreign militaries has had a spotty history in the last 100 years. But working in 30 African countries, I can tell you that I've seen it's a night and day difference whether or not the JSET team has been there, whether or not they've adopted you know, a U.S. military model for its military. You know, and I'm not saying that just to kiss up to the Admiral. But as a veteran, I'm actually kind of very proud of it because it's something I've seen, and I don't think Americans really appreciate enough.
But frankly, I think the U.S. military, learned a lot from bad activities in the 70s and the 80s, particularly in South America. We trained a lot of South American countries, and the next militaries, and the next thing you knew, they overthrew the country. That's not a good thing to have happen. And so this idea that now we go out of our way to reinforce the rule of law and civilian and the importance of civilian leadership, I think, is a key component to everything we do in terms of mill-to-mill engagement.
Well, a lot of it's just teaching the military that its role is to protect the country, not the government.
Right.
Right. Chairman, we tend to focus on addressing food security through reactive measures, emergency food aid, relief assistance. And that can help in the short term, as we discussed. What would you like to see the government do to proactively address food security, to promote strong agriculture and self-sufficient markets in these developing countries, in these fragile countries?
Well, you're right. Sometimes we wait till a disaster occurs and we come in and help them out, and then we're gone. But I think, and yeah, to the Admiral's point, soft power, hard power. I mean, we have to remember you can't do one without the other. They really should play hand in glove, and that's why state has a role and the military has a role. But I think, again, these longer-term strategies that are regional and to deal with agriculture, like the Global Food Security Act, provides funding, but it shouldn't just be borne on our backs. Again, it should be the world responding to these areas to provide the stability necessary. I think NGOs play a great role, Peace Corps, the Again, private investment. If we can ramp that up, that would be great to see in Africa. Because again, they're doing business with the Chinese because again, as they told me, we're not there. So we need to be, sort of looking at that. And going back to what previously, when we passed the Merida initiative, which wasn't exactly our military going in, but it was to try to, when we were seeing Mexico collapsing because our neighbor next door, and NAFTA was very important. I think we need to make sure that gets ratified. But Merida enforced some of the rule of law that was lacking, and the drug cartels are taking over Mexico. Not to say it's gotten a whole lot better. It still worries me, the influence of the drug cartels down there and the corruption. And you had about 150 political assassinations, down there. But it's really in our best interest when it comes to Mexico and Latin America. They're right in our backyard to have stability, right there.
Now, I've seen some governments use foreign aid as a way to benefit their economies. Japan, to me, is one of the great examples. In the 90s, is they were one of the largest donors in terms of foreign aid, but almost, a large part of that was brand new land cruisers going to the United Nations and to aid agencies. It wasn't actually things that were going to help the African. Also, during the 90s, there were USAID chiefs who bragged about how much 85% of every dollar spent on foreign aid was spent in the U.S. economy. Among your colleagues in Congress, do they understand that when you take excess food and put it in Africa, you kind of blow up the local agricultural economy? Or do they now see foreign aid as a good beyond trying to help U.S. farmers or helping the U.S. economy?
Yeah, I think that's, again, the bills we pass is to provide that agriculture assistance, not to, it's better to teach a man how to fish than to give him fish every day. And so that's where it needs to go, and it needs to be, reformed. And again, I'd really see an opportunity in Africa with the private investment. And I think the economic agenda is going to be very important for the State Department to have not just a diplomatic agenda, but an economic agenda to lift up these nations so they are more loyal to us than China.
Mm-hmm. Well, and my colleague Howard French wrote an entire book about how poor Chinese are actually migrating to Africa to stay there, to kind of settle and become part of the fabric of those countries, which is not something I saw a few Americans do that. I considered it briefly, but it's not something I've followed through on. Admiral McRaven, during your time in the U.S. Special Operations Command, for example, your time in Afghanistan, did you encounter any situations where food insecurity directly caused or contributed to an escalation in conflict?
Well, I think that's dovetails off a previous question. What I have seen is, again, food being weaponized. And frankly, Iraq, Afghanistan, every place where there's conflict, food and water become a weapon for the insurgents, for the terrorists. And when you think of candidly why the Taliban have been so successful in some areas is because they also understand how to manage the land. And of course, as you know, in Afghanistan, it is about land rights, and that land right is about kind of food productivity or poppy productivity. But the Taliban could manage the land, could arbitrate the disputes, whereas the local tribal leaders couldn't do that very well. But that was, in a way, weaponizing their policy. So by being the arbitrators of the land issues in the rural areas of Afghanistan, they were the guys that focused the agenda of the locals. And that was a way to, again, move their agenda forward. In terms of, stopping caravans of food and redirecting water. This is always a part of conflict. I don't care whether it's today or, during Alexander's time. That is the way the enemy, and frankly, the Allied forces will always use things to leverage against the enemy and the enemy against the Allies. So you bet, food, water, it is all part of the weapons of war, unfortunately.
I'm going to wrap this up with a question that I ask at the end of every interview. Is there something that I have not asked you that you think is important that I'm missing? Congressman?
Yeah, I look at all the threats. And I look at the foreign adversary nations, basically Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and we have to get this foreign policy right. And these are the new threats to the United States. Radical Islamist still is, still could be. There are threats to airliners today that in a classified realm would terrify you. They're still trying to make bombs to get on airplanes and toxic gases. And there's a lot of stuff that keeps me up at night. And we stopped a lot of bad stuff thanks to this guy. And I want to commend you, sir, for your service and what you did for our country during a very trying time. But I think we got to get it together because these foreign adversary nations are trying to, from a foreign policy standpoint, are starting to fill the vacuum and fill the void in these nations that they want to occupy and turn against the United States. And they're the big four that I mentioned. And how we deal with that's going to be very important. How we deal with NATO is going to be very important. Russia's been very aggressive. They have, they're in the Ukraine kinetically on a ground war. They're in their cyber, throwing every cyber weapon they have in there. They want to get the Baltic states back. Putin's not our friend. He's our enemy. He's trying to take back the glory of the old Soviet empire, you know. You got Kim Jong-un, big threat from a nuclear standpoint. And Iran's theocracy is filling that vacuum, unfortunately, that's left in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon, Gaza. So those threats are all very real. But if I'm looking at who is going to be our major, biggest competitor in the next decade, I would have to say it's China. And they are stealing everything we got, because why invent when you can steal? And we've got to get the cybersecurity down to stop that theft and that aggression and espionage. And as they're trying to go into these countries that are so important for the future, and that is the African continent, we have to realize who our adversary is.
Mm-hmm. Admiral?
You know, whenever we're having national security discussions, I'm often asked what do I think the number one national security issue is, and the one that kind of keeps me up at night. And I think people think I'll answer North Korea or Iran, but my answer is K through 12 education. And the reason this is so important is because we have got to educate the youth of America, or we won't have to worry about national security in the future. The fact of the matter is, events like this, students coming to the LBJ School and to the Strauss and the Clements Center, higher education we do pretty well, but we're going to have to get the young men and women into higher education to begin with. And we have got to give them the tools so that they understand what the international environment is all about. Because again, if all we're educating them on is reading, writing, and arithmetic, and we don't give them an opportunity to, one, go abroad and experience different cultures, experience different ideas, then when it comes time to deal with problems of China, of Latin America, of the Middle East, they won't have the intellectual tools to understand how to do this. Back to my point about the rank and file of the State Department. I mean, I was always amazed. You know, we used to, there was a book out, or there was a thing out one time that said, the Defense Department is from Mars, State is from Venus. That was not meant to be laudatory for the State Department. But I'll tell you what I have found in my time in working with them. They are incredible patriots, incredibly courageous, incredibly dedicated, and incredibly few of them. So, we've got to get young men and women into government service. We've got to get them into the intelligence community, into the law enforcement community, into the State Department where they can make a difference on national security. But that's not going to happen unless we educate the youth of America. So to me, the number one national security issue is the education of the youth of America.
If I could follow up on that, I completely agree. And I think STEM education particularly, you're just seeing a loss of interest in K through 12, getting in science, engineering, mathematics. And so when I look at what's happening in China, I mean, they are starting to clean our clocks. I mean, they are producing more scientists and engineers in China. And I look at my own 5 kids, and they like a lot of other things, and that's sort of true throughout the nation. And I know we import a lot of scientists and engineers into this country, but we have to start educating more in the United States, homegrown, or this issue of cybersecurity, or the issue of quantum computing. Who will be the first nation to achieve quantum computing? Because, as Keith Alexander said, whoever gets it first is going to rule the world. It's like the digital nuclear bomb. It is a powerful tool that we better get there first. And we're not going to be able to do it, as if the Admiral says, we're not educating our youth to go into these fields.
Well, I can tell you that every CEO I talk to in Texas has the same view. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Admiral McRaven and Chairman McCaul for joining us.
My pleasure.